Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Map Making 101 for Company of Heroes 3. My name is John. I am one of the community managers on the team, and I am joined once again by our instructor, Will.
Hello, folks.
So, Will, it sounds like today you've got some rapid fire tips and tricks for us when we're making our maps. Do you want to kind of lay out what we want to cover today?
Yeah, sure. So, the majority of what we're going to cover in this session are the advanced stuff that we might take for granted at Relic. This is the stuff that we've had in our ethos of how to make maps for some time. This is mostly a collection of feedback that I have, having looked at the community maps that have already been made, and just things that I've picked up along the way since mapping for Co 1 and Co 2. Things that you may not even have thought about that you can use in the decisions, the designs that you make in your maps. So we'll rattle through them. This will be a little sporadic. They will go in different directions because there's some art, there's some design focused ones, there's a wide variety of little tips and tricks, but this is the advanced stuff to help your maps reach the next level.
Okay, so this is like when my professor would put a bunch of red lines and edits on my essays and hand it back to me and tell me to redo it.
Sad face, see me. Right, so the first one then is direction design. So we mentioned this very, very briefly, but I want to go back over it again. So, as with all games, it's important to steer your players in the right direction. You'll know some games like third person or action adventure games will use color and lighting, but because we're an RTS, because we're a strategy game, we don't have the benefit of lighting always being consistent. It's also worth noting that because our camera is set to default like this, but some players will move their camera like this, so that they're always playing up the screen, lighting doesn't always work as a directional tool. So we have to use other things where we can. So let's say, for example, we use assets and size as our tool. We've got a good example. We must have some. Yeah, here we are. So we can use asset size in order to guide the eye. So here we have a clump of 3 trees. That would be our, what I'd call a signpost. That is a feature that draws the eye because it's a prominent thing in screen. To the right of that is a smaller single tree. To the right of that is an even smaller single tree. That triangle naturally draws the eye towards the victory point. So up the river to the right. It also works both ways in that if your camera is here, you might be looking at this point here where you're crossing the river and your eye is drawn left towards the bigger bunch of trees in a triangle. It's very, very subtle. But you'll notice it more if you don't have this. If you have loads of parts of your map where everything is the same height. So let's say I didn't put any bushes or trees or anything in. If everything is the same height, you can get lost in areas. Everything looks too similar. These clumps of trees, for example, are a great way of saying this is the corner and it slopes down towards gameplay.
Mm-hmm.
This is the corner, slopes down the road towards gameplay. So we use these everywhere we can. This corner points up, slopes down towards gameplay. So add these little things wherever you can to kind of draw the eye. Even little bits like this. Clump of rocks with a small rock next to it just draws the eye towards the river and across the river. They can be very, very subtle. It may seem like I'm kind of rabbiting on about nothing, but again, you'd be amazed at how much of a difference it can make, especially when we look at buildings. So here we have the entrance to our city. So this is the outskirts. We use a big 3-story building. And then as we go towards the city, we're going right, we use smaller buildings. So it draws the eye that way instead. We also do it here. So we want big building, draw the eye this way. At the back here, we use all the same heights of buildings, which is absolutely fine. But we use a prominent one like the church to draw your eye to the center. And then same here, big, draws you right down. It's more important in urban areas as well to have a difference between tall and shorter buildings so that you can actually see behind them. But this is just a nifty way of making sure the eye is looking in the right direction. But that's just assets and size. We can use other things like actual signposting. So real signposts, for example.
Okay.
You can use. They're way too small for you to actually read the details. But just by having something as simple as a signpost here tells me that there's a deviation, or there's something that the player should be made aware of. You can use arrow signposts like this one to draw your eye towards resources, or ones like this to tell you that there's something more important to the right here, or to the left here, whichever one you want. So use little subtle features like this to try and pull the player's attention in a certain direction. It is very, very common on custom-made maps to lack these simple features, and the whole map can just look like it's a chessboard. It can look like it's just a series of walls, a couple of trees, and everything is around the same height. You can also find that the maps that the community might make, the early maps especially, are just very flat, so the terrain isn't even helping you in that regard. We tend to have hills or gullies be the key points. So like the city here being on a hill draws your attention towards it, whereas the bottom here with the wetlands draws your eye down towards it. Whereas where everything's flat, it almost feels the same. So these three capture points that are in the river don't really feel that much different from each other, apart from the size of the victory point themselves, because there's no terrain features to guide you there. But these cliffs, as the hard boundary that you can't pass over, at least does draw you towards this one. But we have to use things like trees and paths, smoke, water, tracks, things like that to draw you towards the trouble. Speaking of tracks, I suppose, the vehicle tracks are also very, very important. Add them to your roads. It's very easy to just have a road be a gravelly texture, but if you don't have lines in it guiding you in the right direction, they just blend into the terrain and look like nothing. Obviously, there are different levels of subtlety. I've added in some more prominent tracks where I want the player to make hard turns or where I want them to carry on. So there are very, very fine, faint lines where normal traffic would go, but I want tank tracks or treads where I want the player to absolutely make a turn. Right, let's jump on to the next one. So borders between areas. This is probably the most common problem that I find in community maps. If you don't establish hard borders between areas of your maps, it all blends into one. Again, it has that kind of chessboard effect where everything feels a little flat, it blends into each other too much, it doesn't really synchronize with the areas don't synchronize with each other. So by hard borders, I mean things like retaining walls, I mean things like rock outcroppings, things like hedgerows and forests. These hard borders force players to go around them, but it also helps you distinguish the difference between two areas. So here, for example, it's grassy, it's got the exact same ground textures as the other side of the hedge. But it's clear to me because of this border, this is my HQ area and this is not. So it's pretty important for your HQ area to have that first and foremost, because we don't want players to try and build their buildings out of the HQ area and be surprised that they can't. Because the UI will tell you you can't construct here, but it should be the map that shows you why. Right. This is out of this border, therefore you can't do this here.
Are there other ways that we can sort of distinguish these types of borders, aside from just having big rocks and trees and stuff? Like, are there other things that we can utilize?
Absolutely. So this is where changes in things like themes or textures would come in. Because this is a very, very simple idea of a map, I haven't done much texture variation. I've basically used the same tiles the whole map over. But what I have tried to make sure is, at least with the urban area, this is using a completely unique tile set to down here. So players will know this is the rural area, this is the urban area. They will play differently. If you spawn in with your friend because it's a 2v2 and you are on the right side of the map, you are playing in this urban area and that's your responsibility. And it plays very differently to down here. So using different colors of grasses, you might want to go for, say, browner, reddier grasses and foliage up here, and go for lighter, yellower textures down here. I'd originally wanted this area to be a marshland, so I would have gone for lots more browns, darker greens, have far denser foliage, but because I didn't want to to make this overly complex, I just went nice and simple, kept it all the same.
Fair enough.
But you could also do the same with, say, fields. I could have wheat being prominent in one area of the map to help distinguish it from an area which is forested. Now, that said, what you don't want to do is go overboard on the number of themes that you have. So we mentioned before that there are different themes like urban and rural. Don't be tempted to do more than 3 if you can help it. It's always tempting to go and do as much interesting stuff as you can in a map, but honestly, you don't need to. Maps only really need 3 core areas to be interesting, and we tend to put those victory points in those core areas. So if you follow the central line, you've got north, mid, south, or whichever orientation they are. I'm not expecting players to spend most of their time here, so I shouldn't make this any different to the rest of the map in terms of theme. Theme being things like rural, urban, industrial. I could easily make it a component of the existing theme. So this is a rural area. I'm surrounded by open fields and farms. Maybe this could be light industrial. I could make this into a small lumber yard. But what I wouldn't expect to see in this area is concrete and factories.
Yeah.
Nor would I expect to put huge 3-story brick or concrete buildings in this area, because it's just isolated from main roads and isolated from the rest of the city. So don't feel like you have to go overboard and cram every corner with different themes. It's not worth it. People just simply won't play there.
I imagine it would just start to feel really busy.
Yeah, it feels overly busy. It's a waste of time for you. It's just not worth it. So same with all these corners, really. These corners are exactly the same. They're just small rural areas with a resource and a building. Nothing really special, because players will probably just right-click on their mini-map and then right-click straight out of it, and they will never really look at this space. And it's too close to the HQs to ever really see much gameplay. Same goes for this corner over here. Just a resource point in a field next to a road. Don't need to make it special. Same with over here. Just a crossroads. Nothing special. And it doesn't need to be. Don't overdo it. What you do want to do is really hammer down the focus on the theme in the core areas. So I want my cities to look like urban areas. I want to go really deep into the extra details, the planters, the cafes, the tables, chairs, the market stalls. Really go into the details here, because this is where most of your gameplay is going to happen. Same with the fields here, because it's a distinct theme. Go really heavy into that farm feeling. So I have carts, I have baskets, I have barns, I have hay bales. Really just dig into it. You can also do the same with elevation. So if you don't want to have too many themes, use elevation to make your areas distinct, which is exactly what we did on this map. So even though we have 2 rural areas, we have the farms, and then we have sort of fields, but not necessarily farms, just use elevation to be the cutoff point. So this waterfall is the hard marker that from this point on, this area is separated from this area, and you cannot go between them.
Yep.
You have to go around. You can also use bigger roads, so wider roads, more tracks to be the hard cutoff. This is where one area ends, and this is where one area begins. You could also do the same thing with materials of those roads. So, for example, I wanted these roads up here to look more distinct from this road down here. This only uses a dusty texture, whereas this one uses concrete. And it has cobbles alongside it. So make the textures themselves different to tell you this is where the rural ends and this is where the urban begins. Same things with like high walls, or again the retaining walls coming back in, just to clearly distinguish this is where one point stops. If you have maps where all of your areas bleed and blend into each other, it's hard for players to know where they are at any one point in the map. So unless they're looking at the minimap all the time, or unless they're really familiar with that map, you want them to be able to distinguish where they are at any one given time. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's a hell of a skill to hone once you get the hang of it. Okay. Right, let's move on to the more juicy topic of engagement spaces.
Okay.
So this is the topic I tend to cover first with any new people at Relic who come into level design. An engagement space is a hard thing to grasp to begin with, but once you get used to making them, it's the most fun part of the job.
Yeah, I think you mentioned these before. It's kind of the space that takes up your screen at any given point, right?
Absolutely. So yeah, if I go back to my default camera, this is an engagement space. And you want your engagement spaces to be as fun as possible because this is where all the good gameplay is going to happen. It's not going to happen here between the engagement spaces, or rarely is it going to happen in these areas. It's going to happen here. These resources are what you're playing over, so the fight is going to happen here. So make these the interesting locations. So let's say we start with entry points. We want to have ideally 4 ways into every location. Those don't have to be the fairest of entry points, but you want to have as many options as possible. If you go over that, if you go to say 5 or 6 entry points, you stand a chance of the engagement area looking a little bit too vague. Too many roads going into one location just makes it feel like it's open. You still want engagement spaces to feel a little closed off. So, for example, we have one route up here, which is infantry only. We also have a second infantry only route in here. But then we have 1, 2, and even 3 locations that are wide enough for vehicles, tanks, infantry to come into this area. The area itself is mostly light cover. So we have crates, we have suitcases, we have plant pots. Most of it is light cover. There are a few key parts of heavy cover in the wall and the building. You don't want to have too much heavy cover, otherwise you'll never be able to dislodge anyone from that location.
Right. That's one thing that I notice a lot with workshop maps that I don't see in our maps is people often, not often, but sometimes place heavy cover right on a resource point or right on a victory point. And I imagine that that's something that you try not to do.
Yeah, precisely. You'll barely ever notice cover in our capture areas unless it's light. Like these suitcases, I don't believe give any cover at all. This trunk, I think, does give some light cover, but it gets destroyed very quickly. Basically, it will take a Kettenkrad or a 4x4 just driving through this area, and this cover's gone. And that's intentional because we allow units to build their own cover. So building sandbags, for example, is something we want to promote. We want you to choose where you fight. We want you to build your own defenses. By putting heavy cover on a capture area, it means that it's safe enough that you never really have to worry about that. So for casual maps, for bridge maps, for example, having heavy cover in capture areas is absolutely fine. But if you want something that's competitive, keep the heavy cover not only out of the capture area, a little bit beyond that. So this wall, for example, you couldn't capture this point by sitting against that wall.
Right.
That wall is going to be used against you. If you're trying to capture here, the enemy's going to go straight for this, and your only chance is to either use the light cover or use the building where you can't capture.
Right.
So it's a way of almost punishing gameplay that stays in this area for too long. You want to promote getting in, capturing it, and moving on as fast as possible. Let's have a look at another engagement space, just so we can get some examples. So this one is one of our cutoff points. It's a normal strategic point, but if this is captured, if I open up my territory layout, if it's captured, it is one of the major cutoffs for all the resources in the city.
Right. So you'd lose resources if your enemy captured this point. Then.
Absolutely. Yeah. So this is an important one, which is why it has more heavy cover, again, outside of the capture area, way outside the capture area. So you could use this to defend somebody attacking it, say from the top of the hill coming down. You can use these logs to defend, or it can be used in the attack. What's notable here is that we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4 entry points here, one being wider, accidentally selected, but most of this is actually covered by sight and shot blocking walls. These are tall walls, so units can sneak upon this area without being seen pretty easily. But the fun part about engagement spaces is even though this might not seem all that interesting, there's basically no light cover here to speak of, in that this will change as gameplay occurs around it. These wooden fences are like crush. So as soon as a vehicle comes through, it can knock down these fences, and these entry points get wider and wider. So you can have engagement spaces that change over time. It's also worth noting that we expect the heavily frequented areas like this to get plenty of light cover in time. Craters, for example, will occur in these areas. Heavy resource points, victory points, they will get bombarded and they will get plenty of cover in time. So don't worry about having loads of cover in these areas. It will happen. What you don't want to do is provide too many craters yourself before the game has even started. You can make your own craters easily enough because craters never disappear. They never go away. This map is quite a rare example where there is absolutely no destruction on it. There's not a single blown up building or crater or anything on here because I wanted to keep it simple and pristine. But on most of our maps, we will have at least a couple of craters pockmarked here or there, and they help encourage a player think, right, combat's happened here, this is important, and here's permanent cover for me to use, even if it is only light cover. Let's have a little look at some other engagement spaces. Let's just see how different they are. So, yeah, here we are. Nice and easy one. So, this field is very, very different to our urban spaces. Way more open. There's a little bit of sight and shot blocking on the corner, but other than that, you can basically see in and out of this space with no trouble. It has got 5 entry points, but also because these are wooden fences, a light vehicle, again, is just going to knock through these, and it's easy access. And that means the only things that are going to be left behind after maybe the first 5 to 10 minutes are the heavy cover of these hay piles, the stone wall, and this building. So we're giving the player very distinct things to play with, and they're in different parts of the engagement space. This is probably favoring the team on this side, as is the building, whereas this is favoring the defender on this side of the map. So try to make sure that there are fair amounts of cover, even if they're not the exact same cover, but there's fair amounts on either side. And where you can, add in cover that flanks. So this fence doesn't really make much difference for the direction of play. One team over here, traveling this way, towards this team, this cover's useless. But what this cover is not useless against is the other cover we have in here. So if a defender is behind this hay pile, an enemy just needs to follow along the cover here and attack them from this side, and that cover's useless. So even though this is light and this is heavy, if you're on the flank, it's worth nothing. The same goes for here, even though this stone wall is very, very potent. If you use these fences, you just ignore it entirely, as long as you're behind them or on the flank of them. So keep that in mind when you're designing these engagement spaces. And I would highly recommend that even when you are happy with your map and you think you're done, playtest each of these spaces carefully. You grab a friend if you can, otherwise just play against the AI and just see how these spaces play. Is it too easy for you to just lock it down? Can you sit behind a single piece of cover and never feel threatened? If so, it probably needs some refinement. Like, for example, if I find that these hay piles are just too powerful, maybe I need to make this a high wall so the enemy can sneak upon me a lot easier without me shooting back at them. Maybe this needs to be heavy cover instead of light cover so that they can survive longer traveling down this wall to flank me. So all these things that you kind of consider as you play test, easy things to change.
You heard it here. Nerfs to hay coming soon.
Yeah, no, there's not enough rural assets to have heavy cover. It's so difficult making rural areas that aren't just stone walls everywhere. Right. Another thing to consider as well is the addition of permanent cover. So this is rarer. Permanent cover is very, very uncommon. It's mostly in the form of these rocks. There are some rock piles in Company of Heroes 3 that can be destroyed eventually, some that are heavy crush, but these ones in particular are not. These are permanent. Use these sparingly. There's an Africa variant as well. So if I just go on to the blueprint, nature, cliffs, rocks, Africa, anything that says cover next to it is a cover rock. Obviously, they look different because they're Africa. These cannot be destroyed, so use these only where you want gameplay to last a long time, or put them in really dangerous locations. So, for example, this one here, I wanted to put it so that it's within sight of the victory point and the munitions point here, but not really good enough to keep you alive if you're being attacked from any angle. Easily flanked, easy to push you off, and from here it's a long retreat back towards your base where you're going to be even more exposed.
Right.
So these are dangerous to use. They're fantastic. They all last forever. But if you get flanked or a vehicle chases you down, you've got a long way home. And they aren't the kind of cover that you can sit in for the entire game. Okay, that makes sense.
It does.
Okay. Something else to go along with engagement spaces, but it's less about the cover within them, is making sure that they're spaced out enough.
Okay.
So territory should be spaced out pretty well. What you don't want, ideally, is to have any more than 3 territory points in a single screen. So here, for example, I can see 1, 2, 3, 4. These 2 are way off in the distance, though. If I look at this one, I can see 1 just up here. You ideally want to see at least 1. So here I can see this one. Because when you're capturing a territory, you want players to be able to identify the next important location along. This obviously changes depending on how your camera angle is, but let's say I'm here, for example, I can see the victory point, I can't see anything else, but the next one isn't far away.
Right.
What you don't want is to have all your capture points so close to each other that the engagement spaces spill into each other. This can happen with victory points. If your victory points are too close to a capture area, then the fights for this location become the same fights for this location, and it gets a little bit messier. It's hard to know where you stand. It's hard to know where it's best to put the cover as well for those locations. So just be a little cautious. It's nice to have very distinct locations per resource so that they're memorable and that they can help guide you towards the next location. This is a perfect example. I can see a victory point, I can see a point across the bridge, and I can see another point across the bridge. Perfect. I know I can either go this direction, or this direction. So it's just giving you a bit of a guide where to go, and they don't impact each other. If a fight is happening in this VP, it's not happening here. So just keeping those areas separate. You can always tell if your locations are too close to each other if you test in-game. So don't forget, you go to build mod, go and play test, and if you look at a minimap and you can't easily click on a capture point on your minimap because there's another location on your minimap too close, it means they are overlaying each other.
Okay.
What you don't want players to suffer through is misclicking the wrong capture point in a hurry. If they're in the middle of a firefight and they want to move units somewhere else and they right-click the wrong capture point because there's 2 too close to each other, then you've got a problem. So make it easier for your players and make it easier for you as the designer. Spread them out a little bit. Even if that means getting rid of a capture point because there is too many, that's absolutely fine. Bigger maps, 3v3s, 4v4s, should have more capture points, but when it comes to 1v1s and 2v2s, you don't need that many.
Okay.
Right. Moving on to the art side. Now, this is where I'm talking about stuff that I am not as familiar with because it's not my area of expertise. I get it. I understand the concepts of it, but I probably couldn't back it up as to why it works the way it does. So the first thing to talk about is scale of your textures. Textures look odd if they're over or undersized, mostly if they're oversized. So if I'm at my default camera, what I'm looking for in my map is things that might look too big. For those of you who play tabletop games, for example, if you look at, say, basing materials, sand for a 28mm miniature is like the size of gigantic rocks to them. What we're looking for is something similar. Is this stone here too big for our models? So if I grab, say, a suitcase, something that I'm sure we can all reasonably associate the size of, and I put it down here, these rocks here are probably about a foot in diameter.
Right.
They're
Fairly
pretty big.
large, yeah.
So if you feel like some things are too big, then you can reduce the size of them. You can reduce the scale. You just go to your tiles. I believe this is dirt pile large. And if I go down to the properties of it, believe it's here. Yeah, UV scale. If I drop down to 1, I believe. Oh, no, it's the other way around. If I go to 2, they get scaled down. So if you really want to, you can scale some of your textures down to make them look more realistic, or to help them blend in. The smaller something is, the more it will blend in. The bigger it is, if I go for 0.5, for example, they look huge, they draw the eye, they don't blend at all. Oops, I just got rid of that. So those rocks now look pretty hideous.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't do. If I go back to what they were by default, they look quite nice.
Mm-hmm.
But if I make them 1.5s instead,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. That's really noticeable now.
subtle.
Yeah.
So changing the size is what we would refer to as the crunch, the crunchiness of something. If it looks too crunchy, it looks messy. If you've got too many shadows, too many large objects drawing the eye, it looks messy. Here, where the grass is, this all blends in really nicely, especially with the benefit of adding the 3D grass. It's hard to know where one texture begins and where one ends. That's also the benefit of using the blend tool the way that we did. Setting it to 0.2, I could add in a couple of these stones into the grass here, and I'm on the wrong one. If I go to Dirt Pile Large, you barely notice. Really subtly blend them in. It looks fine. With the default camera, you barely spot a thing. But having textures that stand out too much just really distracts the eye. It looks messy. And that's more important around gameplay spaces. So our artists try to have the core gameplay spaces look as well traveled as possible. So if we take here, for example, in the city, instead of having this entire area be all the flagstones, so it's all cobble, it's lots of jigsaw pieces of stone, we have mixed in dirt and potholes and things like that to try and get rid of that crunch. We don't want it to look messy, we want it to look traveled. We could do so even more. If I grab the dirt light, I can just sprinkle some more in, especially around the capture point where I think people would be treading, and it just looks like it's more well-traveled and it helps it stand out. That now stands out more prominently from the cobbles around it. You may have also noticed I have helped that, if I just grab anything generic, underneath my capture points, I have added those splats that we talked about. So I have a grime splat. Looks like that. Very, very simple, but by adding it underneath the fuel, it makes it look like it belongs to the terrain that it's on. It almost gives it a bit of a fake shadow. Same goes for things like the market stalls. I've added bits of debris, I've added some wood, I've added some stones, dirt underneath to make it look like people have been standing up against this and brushing dirt underneath the tables with their feet. So you can help ground these assets in reality by choosing your textures carefully. In terms of crunch, we also try and encourage paths being as smooth as possible. When vehicles travel on gravel, that gravel becomes sand, sand becomes dust. So if you've got a very busy urban road, you don't want loads of gravel all over this, because it wouldn't be the case. The gravel here gets pushed to the side. If you look at rural roads in particular, they're dusty, they're not rocky. You might have some infrequently traveled roads where there is more rocks in the middle. Like, for example, here where I've got the grass running through the middle. This is because a single vehicle's come down here, they've eroded the dirt away. They've eroded the grass away, and it's just left this snail trail of grass right in the middle here. So have your roads be smooth. Use tracks, obviously, to give you direction, but don't make all your roads really gravelly, because it just distracts the eye. It doesn't look realistic enough. Have the gravel to the sides. It helps you draw attention to what the width of the road is. And again, that changes depending on how busy the road is. Urban areas, nice and smooth. Rural areas, a bit bumpier. Right. Besides that, I suppose lighting is something we have already covered before, but is worth mentioning again, just to reiterate it. You are the one who chooses the sunlight direction and the sunlight height. So use this to your advantage. I really, really like the camera angle we have, and I like the lighting angle we have. If I go to my atmospheres, here it is. I love that the mud here and all the potholes get shown up by sunlight. I think that's great.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to remember what your number is if you find something good and just give it a bit of an adjustment and see how it changes things. So if I move my light over here to say 170, I lose the reflections, sure, but I now have shadows that are coming from the north going south. So this might be something I feel the map needs. If I want more players to move up the map or down the map, I can set my sunlight to do that for me. I can go the other way as well. If I want my players to go laterally across the map, I can have my sunlight in that direction to help draw them towards these reflections. So when I'm looking at this area, my eye is being drawn towards the light, which is towards my enemy. And if I'm on this side of the map, I'm being drawn away from the light. I'm being drawn towards the flatter textures. Use these to your advantage. It's such a simple way of manipulating your map how you like. The same goes for the actual sun angle itself. So don't forget that the higher in the sky the sun is, the shallower the shadows are. You lose a lot of that ground bumpiness as well. So here you can barely notice the reflections anymore. You get some of the alpha levels in the potholes. But if I go deeper, the lighting changes, things get darker, moodier, and you just get so much more out of the textures you've chosen. It's obviously tempting to go real dark, but that also then starts impacting visibility.
Right.
The lower your light is, the harder your map is to read. So it's about choosing a sweet spot. Same goes with the sunlight color as well. If you change your sunlight color to something like a very vibrant sunrise red, then you're gonna expect to lose some of the colors of your map. If I go, let's say like that kind of almost dusky, it looks beautiful, but now it's hard for me to tell in some places where the dirt ends and the grass begins.
Yeah. I have noticed in a few workshop maps as well. Sometimes I find it's hard to read things, or that something just looks kind of off about the entire look of the map. And I imagine lighting and sunlight angle and stuff plays a big factor in that.
Absolutely, yeah. It's such a major impact on it, and it's always going to be a bit of a toss up as to how heavy you land in one direction or the other. You can either go really realistic, beautiful lighting, but gameplay suffers as a consequence because units and cover become harder to read, or you go very gameplay centric where units are very easy, the terrain is easy to read, but the lighting is pretty generic. Obviously, we like to try and meet somewhere in the middle. But if you look at somewhere like Monte Carlo, which we released recently, Monte Carlo has a nighttime atmosphere, which by its nature is hard to read. But what we did instead to offset that is add lighting around the map so that you have improved visibility where it matters. So at the bottom near your HQ, on the way up the hill, the lighting is not amazing. It looks atmospheric, but it doesn't play very well. But we have spotlights, we have searchlights where the gameplay is going to occur because we want you to be able to see more there. So it's a creative process. It's entirely up to you, but that's my recommendation. If you want something competitive, make the lighting nice and clear. Use the lighting to your advantage as well to get the most out of your textures. But if you're in it just for you and your friends and you want to make something casual, really go moody. Okay, and then one last point is to always keep crush in mind. So almost all of our map assets have a crush value. It's either light or it's heavy. Light crush are going to be your wood, your foliage, things like fences, bushes, small trees. They're light crush. They will disappear in no time. Any gameplay around like these fences, a vehicle will knock them down, an HMG will blow them apart. It doesn't take much for these assets to disappear. So use these everywhere you want. There is really no restriction. Your map can be absolutely covered in light cover and it won't make much of a difference because most of it will be gone by the time you hit the 10-15 minute mark. Heavy cover, on the other hand, things like compacted straw, metal, brick, stone, that sort of stuff is going to last a lot longer. Some of it longer than others. As we mentioned, these rocks are permanent. whereas this straw, I believe, is the lowest health heavy cover asset we have in the game, because it would stop a bullet, but it wouldn't stop a tank shell.
Right.
So use these more sparingly, and also keep in mind that light vehicles cannot crush through these. As I showed you in the previous episode, if you go to the path map, so I'm going to show you again, impasse map, I'm going to select only light vehicles. So I want to see only the things that light vehicles cannot pass through. If I now go to scenario, overlays, path map, and then I click this little magic button that says deselect all, I can now see the assets that light vehicles cannot crush. So light vehicles cannot go through these walls, they cannot go through these rocks, they can go through these bollards, but they can't go through these wrought iron fences. They can't crush cars, they can't crush trucks, but they can crush market stalls. So have a look at your map with this overlay on, just to see how passable areas are. You'd be surprised at just how easy it is to make impassable areas on your maps. And you can use this in different ways as well. So let's say, for example, I want to see how viable AT guns are on my map. So I'm going to get rid of those. AT guns technically count as infantry. You'll notice we've got vaulting infantry. That would be your riflemen, your grenadiers. Anything that can vault is a vaulting infantry. Anything that can't vault is just infantry. So HMGs, mortars, AT guns.
Gotcha.
Deselect all. And this tells me everywhere that an AT gun cannot go. That's important because AT guns cannot crush. They basically act like light vehicles because they're slow and they're bigger than an infantry squad, but they can't crush. So these bollards, for example, cause big problems for AT guns.
Right.
This area is probably too narrow. This bridge is certainly too narrow. This courtyard technically is not pathable for an AT gun.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
But AT guns enter the game late enough that chances are a vehicle has already come through here and knocked at least some of these down. So keep these in mind. You don't have to adhere to those rules strictly that everywhere must be accessible to everyone, but do keep in mind that some things will be, more inaccessible. This engagement area is better because it always has a route that they can enter, even if the other three entrances have got bollards over them. So always look at your map. Between playtests, have a look at how these areas appear to AT guns, light vehicles, even try it with heavy vehicles like heavy tanks. Put that overlay on just to see where can a Tiger not go and for what reason. Again, is there a hidden asset? Is there something buried in your map that you didn't know about? Use these overlays to your advantage. They are going to show you things that you won't see in game, and they're eye-opening. Right, I believe that is everything. That is all of my advanced techniques that come to mind. There will inevitably be more that will pop up, but this should give you all the key information you need to get your own map set up and make it as good as it can possibly be. So really enjoy your time with the editor. It's a great tool. There's so much you can create. I'm biased. I love making maps, but I really, really cannot wait to see the creations that you folks come out with.
Okay, so thanks so much, Will, for walking us through this. This entire series has been great. Stay tuned, folks. I think we may have a couple extra bonus episodes with someone else on the team coming up. But as always, links for everything are going to be in the video description. So you can find our Modding Knowledge Center, where we have some handy guides. You can find our Discord, where you can talk to other map makers like yourself and ask questions. Sometimes the devs will keep an eye on that chat and answer questions when they can. But thanks so much, Will. I guess that's it for now, and we'll have to come back should you have any other advice to pass along to folks in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, folks, so thanks so much, and we will catch you next time.
Thanks, folks.